Hey guys, how is it going? And welcome back to another episode here for more Pot Limit Omaha content. Today we're jumping in 5 tips if you're new to PLO and if you want to give yourself a great start into the game. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the link below the episode to PLOmastermind.com. If you want to learn more about the game, not only from me, but also other professional PLO players, then head over there and stay tuned for the Black Friday sale, which is next week, where we have massive discounts to our yearly subscribers. So let's get right into it, guys. 5 tips if you are new to PLO, and I want to jump right into tip number 1, and that is PLO is a nut game. Now, keep in mind that this video might be a little bit too basic for some of you, but if you are new to the game or in the beginning phases of your career, I think the tips that I will give you today are very helpful. So, in my opinion, one of the most important things to realize when you're new to the game is that PLO is a game that all centers around the nuts and having the nuts by the river. It's very important to think about in every stage of the hand, how likely is it that my hand can be the nuts or can at least be a near nut hand when the river is being dealt? Because every player has 4 cards in their hand, the likelihood of your specific holding being the nuts on the river is very different from that as it is, for example, in No Limit Hold'em. Because you have 4 cards and also your opponent has 4 cards and maybe other players in the pot also have 4 cards, it becomes more and more important to have a very strong hand on later streets and on the river specifically if you want to put money into the middle. So when I look at how players are playing, and especially beginning players, they overvalue a lot of their hands that they play. For example, low pairs or medium-high pairs, in PLO they are not as strong as they can be, for example, in No Limit Hold'em. In No Limit Hold'em, having a set is an extremely powerful hand. But in PLO, a set can be almost worthless on many of the runouts, especially if there are straights possible, if there is a flush possible, or if there are multiple players in the pot and there are a lot of overcards to your bottom or middle set. So PLO is a nut game, and you want to pick hands that you're playing that have a high likelihood of beating nuts on the river, or at least a near nut hands. Value betting hands that are not the nuts or are not the near nuts on the river is not something that is extremely common in PLO. The threshold of value betting is quite high, and that is because the likelihood of your opponent having a strong hand, or at least a decent hand when we arrive on the river, is also a serious concern. So value betting like a bottom straight, or middle or bottom 2 pair, for example, it's not really a thing in PLO as often as you might expect. So especially if you come from No Limit Hold'em, be aware that you should be extremely selective with a lot of the bets that you make with your pre-flop hand selection, and keep in mind that you want to draw to the nuts. So you want to have high suits, high pairs, you want to have connectivity that generally and preferably center around the high end of the board. So you much rather have a connected hand like Queen, Jack, 10, 9 than a connected hand that is like 6, 7, or 7, 6, 5, 4 basically. High rundowns, high suits, and high pairs. That is a lot what PLO centers around. Okay guys, number 2 on the list today is pick your hands or pick your starting hands very carefully and in a way that is somewhat in line with tip number 1. Because pre-flop hand selection in PLO is extremely important. Even though equities run much closer in PLO than they do in No Limit Hold'em, it's extremely important to pick the right hands in the right situations and play them. I see a lot of people that are new to the game playing way too many hands, and therefore ending up in a lot of difficult situations on later streets. So again, focus on hands that can be very strong on later streets, that can value bet on a lot of the runouts, and that can deal with aggression if your opponent puts bets into the pot. And generally, you want to focus on connectiveness, on suitedness, and on high cards. That is generally a great starting point. In terms of frequencies and hand selection, you want to become wider and you can be more aggressive the less people are in the pot, which is a general poker concept, of course, not that different from other games. But you want to be very selective, for example, with your open raising ranges in early and middle position. There are a lot of hands that might look playable or actually very strong, like some of the kings and queens in specific, but they are clear folds very often in early or middle position. The same goes for 3-betting and even 4-betting. In PLO preflop, there is a massive gap in terms of strength when it comes to having aces versus any other pair. So if you decide to 3-bet or 4-bet, aces make up for the vast majority of those ranges. So be very selective, careful. Keep in mind how wide your opponents are playing, adjust correctly, but it all starts from understanding your ranges yourself correctly and know what hands to play in what situations in sort of a standard game. What is your default strategy? So keep that in mind. Focus on pre-flop hand selection a lot. Don't get carried away by the fact that you have 4 cards in your hand, that almost any hand looks playable, and because pre-flop equities run relatively close, you can play a lot of hands. There's a ton of situations where you have to be very selective and you pick your hands carefully. Next up, guys, position is king. And this is true in almost any poker format, but the more cards you will have in your hand, position can become more important even, because the informational advantage that you have when you are in position becomes larger. And that's because you have more cards in your hand and therefore have more information that is available. When you look into PLO strategies or poker concepts in general, the in-position player is almost always, or basically always, in an advantage, right? And that is because the out-of-position player has to act first. And the effect of that is that because the out-of-position player has to act first, the in-position player knows, based on what the out-of-position has done, how he can play his hand or his range as good as possible. Being in position, you can almost in any situation over-realize the actual equity that you have with your hand versus your opponent's range or versus your opponent's hand. Over-realizing your equity is often very difficult in a lot of situations, but if you are in position, that is actually a situation where it is much easier and much more common to actually do. The raw equity of your hand is often, or let me rephrase this, like the equity that you have with your hand can easily be over-realized when you're in position because you have the informational advantage of your opponent and you have the chance to take a free card and check back with hands that don't benefit from building a pot. Well, if you're out of position, you have to act first and you have to think about, hey, not only can I bet or check, I can also, if I check, I don't necessarily get that free card because my opponent still has the chance to put in a bet, even though I don't want to put in a bet with this hand because I check. So out of position, you have to take a lot of things into consideration, not only your CBet strategy or your betting frequency out of position, but also the fact that if you check, you have to make sure that you have enough hands in your checking range that can, for example, check back or check raise, because otherwise your opponents can simply take a lot of steps, power of position, stabbing a lot, especially in games where people over check fold. The power of position is huge. Okay, guys, so keep in mind that position is king and that whenever you are in position, really, it's generally speaking a great situation. It's very likely that you can over-realize your equity. It's very likely that the out-of-position player is going to check fold too often, not check raise enough often. And at the same time, you always have the chance to check back and realize the equity of your hand by taking a free card. Fourthly, we're talking about blockers in PLO, and blockers, of course, are crucial. The more cards you get dealt, so for example in 4 card, but this becomes even to a more extreme in 5 or 6 card, blockers become more important and stronger. Think about it like this. If you're up against a player who is betting the flop and then betting the turn on a board where there's a flush available, and you don't have the nut flush or the nut flush blocker, it's very difficult to maneuver on those board textures if you know that your opponent can easily have the nut flush. And the likelihood of your opponent having the nut flush, of course, is higher because he has 4 cards in his hand and not only 2. So fighting back and dealing with aggression on some of the runouts, if you're up against a very polarized range that is putting aggression on you and is basically representing the nuts, can be extremely difficult in PLO because it's such a nutted game and your opponent's betting strategy is often centered around having the nuts. So when you know that and when you experience that being the defender, you also know that if you are the aggressor, you can use blockers very efficiently because your range is often strong enough to have a lot of aggression with the blockers because you also have a lot of value. For example, again, the flush board. Like you will have a lot of nut flushes in many of the situations. So therefore, if you have the nut flush blocker and you start to pot the flop or bet the flop, pot the turn, pot the river, it becomes very, very difficult for your opponents to fight back. So blockers are crucial, and this becomes extremer the more cards you will have in your hand. So not only is this a thing on flush runouts, it can also be a thing on straight runouts, for example. Let's say the board is Jack 10-9 and you have a pair of queens in your hand without anything else. It's very easy and very common for you to just go bet, bet, bet over 3 streets with your blockers and make your opponent fold a set, a 2 pair, a lower straight, for example, because he cannot fight back well enough against your polarized range, especially when he knows that you will have a lot of nuts there as well. So keep that in mind, that blockers are crucial and that you can often play them fairly aggressively if the right situation occurs. And lastly, a very important one, and this is something that I see a lot also with private students of myself, is that generally CBet frequencies for many of the PLO players, but especially also if you're new to PLO, CBet frequencies are often on the very high end. The idea of, hey, I'm the pre-flop aggressor, so I can do a lot of betting and I should do a lot of betting, it doesn't necessarily hold through in many situations. And that is often because ranges are not as asymmetric, basically, as you might expect. It's not the case that one player has like a ton of very strong hands and a massive range advantage, and that the other one is basically struggling a lot. Now, often ranges are quite competitive. Now, there are, of course, exceptions, right? On situations where you have a very tight range and your opponent has somewhat of a wide range and the board is high card heavy. Yes, you can do a ton of betting and sometimes even close to your full range. If you're a 3-bet pot and the board is ace high, yes, you can probably bet your entire range in many of these situations. But in the classic single raise pot situation or the classic 3-bet pot situation where you don't have a massive range advantage and the board isn't ace high, often CBet frequencies become centered around like a 50-50. So 50% betting, 50% checking. And if the board is very disadvantageous for you, very often you end up checking way more often even. Sometimes even your entire range. So don't make the mistake of over c-betting. There are situations when it's correct as well. Already mentioned a few. Or if your opponent is massively over folding versus bet, it's fine to exploitatively bet more. But don't make it your default strategy really to have c-bet frequencies of like 60, 70, 80%. Be selective, protect your checking range. Keep the pot small with hands that don't benefit from building a pot. The thing in PLO is that you want to bet hands, generally speaking, that benefit from building a pot. And those hands are the ones that can continuously bet on a lot of the turns and river runouts, that have an equity advantage versus your opponent, that have powerful blocker components down the road to make your opponent's better hands fold. And if your hand doesn't have any of these characteristics, then often it is the right play to pot control and keep the pot small. Okay, guys, 5 tips. We went through all of them. Now, what I want to let you guys know is that PLO is a great game. It is super fun. There's a ton of action in there. There's also a ton of variance. So if you're new to it, don't underestimate the variance for sure. You will see a ton of crazy all-ins, a lot of action, and It's all about getting used to it, embracing it, and understanding that by the end of the day, all those elements also attract more recreational players, which will down the road give you an opportunity to win more money in the game. So that's going to be it, guys. I hope you enjoyed this quick video about some insights from me to you about getting started with PLO. Again, stay tuned for the Black Friday sale at plomastermind.com next week. And massive discounts will be there for all of you for our yearly subscription products. Guys, thank you very much for watching. Subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also thank you very much for watching. Over and out. This is Luke. Catch you guys in the next one.